Rachel Nuwer is an award-winning science journalist who regularly contributes to the New York Times, National Geographic, Scientific American, and many other publications. Her reporting for the New York Times broke news globally about the MDMA Phase 3 clinical trial and was highlighted by Michael Pollan, Ezra Klein, and Tim Ferriss, among other thought leaders. In 2022, Nuwer was among the inaugural recipients of the Ferriss UC Berkeley Psychedelic Journalism Fellowship. Dr. Sunil Kumar Agarwal is a physician and medical geographer. He is a board-certified fellow of the American Academy of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation and the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine, where he was named a top 20 emerging leader. He is the past chair of the Integrative Medicine Special Interest Group and an inaugural member of the Safe Use in Psychedelic-Assisted Therapies Forum. Agarwal has been qualified as an expert in cannabis and psilocybin medicinal and religious use, and ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and MAPS MDMA-assisted therapy. He is the co-founder and co-director of Seattle's Ames Institute. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Nuwer and Dr. Sunil Kumar Agarwal.
You got your mic? Oh, here it is. Thank you all so much for coming.
Hello. So excited to have Rachel here today. We're going to start off by asking some general questions about her new book called I Feel Love, MDMA and the Quest for Connection in a Fractured World. We met a while ago working on another article that Rachel had put out in Scientific American on another psychedelic-related topic for
really
palliative care.
One.
So excited to meet you again for the first time, working in this way. So let's talk a little bit about this molecule and what exactly does MDMA stand for? And I mean, when did it even arrive in the world? Is it, how old is it? And the book is amazing, and the history is like full of all kinds of twists and turns. So maybe you can walk us through that a little bit.
Definitely.
And finally, last thing, Berkeley, my alma mater. How did that play? What role did that play in MDMA?
So much to unpack here. So first of all, my only C in college was in chemistry, so please don't ask me much more besides MDMA's name, which is methylene dioxymethamphetamine. I even practiced learning to draw the chemical structure because I was afraid someone in a talk would ask me, and it would be humiliating not to know. Anyway, MDMA's story begins on Christmas Eve 1912 when the pharmaceutical company Merck in Germany filed a patent for it. And they weren't after MDMA, they were after a blood clotting agent, and MDMA was just some chemical intermediary on the way to get there. There's questions about whether or not Merck actually realized the psychoactive properties of MDMA in the years that it held the patent. There were some inklings of that in their files in the 20s. Merck says they did not test MDMA in humans, but they also won't let inquiring journalists look at their archives. MDMA pops up again in the 1950s in an exceptionally unethical and shameful chapter of US history when the CIA and the Army were testing drugs as chemical truth serums to manipulate agents and things like this. But they were testing these drugs on soldiers and also on unconsenting patients at hospitals around the country. There's no smoking gun that says that MDMA was actually administered to a patient. There are some documents that sort of hint that it might have happened at Tulane University in New Orleans, but again, no definitive evidence. But I think it is important to acknowledge that perhaps the first person who was ever given MDMA was given it without their consent. And especially that's significant because we're looking now at giving some of our veterans MDMA-assisted therapy to heal them when the US Army might have been doing this unethically. The first person finally to definitively take MDMA by name that we know was an undergraduate student at UC Berkeley.
Go Bears.
His name was Karl Resnikoff. Now, Karl almost certainly was not the first person to take MDMA because there were some seizures in Chicago and a few other places around the country in 1970, 1971, 72, after the Controlled Substances Act was passed. And that was likely because another drug called MDA, which is really closely related to MDMA, but without this N-methyl group, there's my chemistry again. There were seizures of MDMA because MDA was put on the Controlled Substances Act, so probably some smart chemists had just stuck that methyl group on there to get around the law. But again, we don't know who these chemists were. We don't know who their possible customers were. We do know Karl. So Karl was this undergrad at UC Berkeley, and he was obsessed with psychedelic drugs, and he found out that one of the professors there was what is now the renowned psychedelic chemist Alexander Sasha Shulgin, who I'm sure a few of you have heard of. Shulgin synthesized something like 200 psychoactive compounds himself and would try them on himself and his friends and write all kinds of notes about it. But Karl hooked up with Shulgin and said, hey, will you be my mentor? Can we do a summer project together? And Shulgin was like, sure. What do you want to do? And Karl loved MDA personally, so he said, I know that methamphetamine is more euphoric than plain amphetamine, so maybe if we stick that methyl group on MDA, that too will be more euphoric. And Shulgin's like, that's a great idea. So the two of them holed up in a lab at UC Berkeley in the summer of 1975. They synthesized MDMA, and young Karl went off and took some of it with his girlfriend Judith on a ferry from San Francisco to Sausalito, and surprise, he had a great time. And he reported back to Shulgin very favorably about the experience. So that launches MDMA's story.
Wow. Okay. See, how much of that history did you guys know? This is amazing. What you uncover while you dig into it. Okay. So now let's turn a little bit to what's been happening in the news, and potentially we might be looking at approval by the Food and Drug Administration within the year for the MDMA as an adjuvant or assisted therapy, a tool. So I'd like to ask you, where did that start, the use of MDMA as a therapeutic, rather than, most of the time with MDMA, when it came to my consciousness, it was about raves and dance music. But what are the early uses, or where does that even start, this sort of therapeutic piece?
Yeah, I love that you pointed that out. I think most people, well, definitely me, when you think of ecstasy or MDMA, you think of raves, parties, the late 80s, the 90s. In fact, MDMA's therapeutic use dates back to Alexander Shulgin. After he and Karl synthesized the drug, in 1976, he actually took it himself, and he was like, wow, this is really interesting. He'd taken a lot of drugs. He compared it to a low-calorie martini. It just made conversation flow. He's a little inebriated, but not so much that he couldn't keep his wits about him. However, in experimenting with MDMA on himself, this word kept popping back into his head, and that word was window. He was thinking of a window into consciousness opening up and into the soul, into the heart. And he thought, okay, you know what, I really need to share this drug with a friend of mine, this therapist named Leo Zeff. Leo Zeff was later known as the secret chief among his friends because he was sort of the chief who spread MDMA around all these therapists, starting in the Bay Area and then more broadly across the US and even into Europe. So this really strong contingency of MDMA-assisted therapists rose up throughout 1976 until the drug scheduling in 85. And they were trying purposefully to keep quiet about this because they had all seen what happened with LSD, with this war on drugs mentality. They knew that if the DEA got word about MDMA, they would definitely schedule it because outside of that therapeutic context, MDMA does feel good, and a drug that makes you feel good, people want to use outside of the medical context, and that's exactly what wound up happening.
Wow. I mean, actually, you mentioned LSD and its role. It also began in therapy, and I was really surprised to learn in your book that you said that 40,000 patients had been treated with LSD psychotherapy before it was banned.
Yeah, I mean,
is that right?
LSD clinics started in the UK, and then they spread to Canada. Anyone, I guess, who was in the Michael Pollan book club will know all about that. But, MDMA sort of stepped into this existing psychedelic assisted therapy framework that had been laid by LSD and things like ibogaine. And, that's the Western framework, but it's also important to acknowledge that indigenous groups have been using psychedelic agents for, hundreds, if not thousands of years for healing.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so let's turn to the topic of criminalization. The war on drugs is still going, and we just had a vote here at the City Council last week whether we would want to recriminalize drug use here because our state had passed something, and it didn't pass. But it's sort of an issue. People want to know what to do about drug use. And so my question was for you, just in terms of this drug, like if it was this sort of therapeutically promising thing, so many people were finding it. Why did we? And it was pretty recent that we banned it. 85, and why did that happen, and how come we waited until here we are in 2023, to realize its benefits? So can you share about that? What can we learn from that?
Yeah, there's so many parts to that question. I guess I'll tell first the story of how the banning came about. So like I said, MDMA is a drug that makes you feel good when taken in a certain setting. And people wanted to capitalize on that. There was the therapeutic group who was like, okay, let's keep this hush-hush. Let's use it for these elevated purposes. But then there were also people who just liked to party on it and also wanted to make money on it. There was this group called the Texas Group, and they really proliferated MDMA in centers like New York City, San Francisco, and even Dallas. And these became really big party hubs for legal use of MDMA. And that's how it came to the DEA's attention. The DEA moved to schedule MDMA to put on Schedule 1, which is the strictly banned drugs like heroin and LSD. By definition, they have no medical use, and they have a high potential for abuse. And unlike LSD, a group of therapists, doctors, even professors from Harvard, for example, got together, Shulgin among them, and decided to fight back against the scheduling and to make a case that MDMA should be on Schedule 3, which would permit therapists to continue using it medically and also permit research to continue, because it's just very, very difficult to do research on Schedule 1 drugs.
And let me just interject here.
Yeah.
That criteria is no currently accepted medical use in treatment in the United States. The reason that currently accepted piece is in our law, because that was part of also one of the arguments they were making. Well, there's all these doctors and therapists that are accepting its use, and what does that count for?
Yeah,
and so it's part of the
That's
story.
why we have the expert on stage.
We're working on a
Thank
similar
you.
case with psilocybin right now, and so I've become familiar with some of these nuances.
Become familiar is yeah. So they put together this case, and they actually, they technically won their case. The administrative law judge sided with them and said, yes, it is currently accepted, and it should be on Schedule 3, but because of technicalities with how DEA law works, maybe you know this better than me.
Politics.
Politics. That was only a suggestion, and the DEA was like, we're not taking that suggestion. We're going to do what we want to do anyway, move forward and put it on Schedule 1, which is where it has remained until today. In terms of why it's taken so long, there's all kinds of factors at play, from the medicalization of psychiatry. So, talk therapy was out with the advent of Prozac. It was a simple drug for a simple bug, they said, which is a nice model when you have a bacterial or a viral infection, but not when you're dealing with something as complex as the human psyche. There's also just this sort of puritanical framework of living and looking at the world that we Americans and British tend to have. Anything that's going to make you feel good is, that's not good. But really, politics is the big thing. There was tremendous politicization of science in terms of the studies that got funded. Any studies that were funded of MDMA were studies that were expressly looking for ways that it harms people, that, looking for, that neurotoxicity data, the MDMA tolls in your brain, Parkinson's stuff, all that hype of the 90s was funded by grants from the government, and yeah, politics.
Yeah, and there were some delays, long delays after when folks started actually doing investigation or trying to get it through the FDA process. There was even that was sort of very slow walked, and they would lose applications multiple times. You tell that story as well, right?
Oh yeah, it's just like dystopian.
Unbelievable. But, okay, so let's shift out of that. We can come back to some other topics around law and society. I think these are really important that we can talk about these, and thanks to your book. The mechanism of action. This is kind of you gave the example in your book about how Sir Alexander Fleming, discovered this amazing treatment from the mold that he was studying accidentally, but it took years and years or decades from after that was widely used as seen as this breakthrough, miracle treatment, penicillin, that we actually understood that it interrupts the cell wall synthesis in bacteria. So what about MDMA-assisted therapy? Like, how long did it take for us to figure out anything, or what do we know, if we know anything at all?
Yeah, so what do we know? It's a process, it's science, it's iterative, but there's some really, really interesting work that's come out in the past few years. And actually, there's an amazing study that's being published tomorrow in Nature by the researcher at the forefront of this. Her name is Guldo Lin. She's from Johns Hopkins. So any Nature readers out there, check out her paper tomorrow. But in 2019, she had a study come out that elucidated the mechanisms of perhaps MDMA-assisted therapy. So, before this, we knew that MDMA lowered activity in, for example, the amygdala, the brain's fear center, and helped with information processing and some other nifty things. But it was still well, why is this working? Why is this really helping people overcome, trauma that they've had for, years and years and years that other treatments, including talk therapy, had failed to address? Guldo Lin found that MDMA, and these are experiments in mice, I might add, or I should add, MDMA, when given in the proper set and setting, it reopens what's called a critical period. And this is what neuroscientists use to refer to kind of an intuitive concept that we all are familiar with. It's this window of finite malleability in the brain, usually during childhood, where you're primed to learn a new skill. It's like if you think of the ease at which a child learns a new language, and then that child grows up without an accent. It's pretty much any skill that we need to survive in the world, from walking to seeing to smelling to speaking. So the theory here is that MDMA, when given in the context of the therapist's office, when you're primed to do that work, that psychological reevaluation, it reopens a specific critical period called a social reward learning critical period, and it allows you to reevaluate your trauma, to see it anew, and to literally rewire how you're processing that trauma. Because we now know, based on lots of other studies, that people with PTSD, their brains are literally different than people who have not been traumatized. So, if these results prove correct, it's an incredibly powerful concept, because at least Gould's thinking that it's all about set and setting for reopening these critical periods. So, okay, in the therapist's office, when you're going to do a reappraisal of your trauma, that's the critical period that opens. But what if you pair MDMA with, say, stroke rehabilitation to regain movement? You could reopen a critical period for motor reward learning or motor learning, and potentially regain some of that lost movement. She's working on studies on stroke now at Johns Hopkins, but there could be all sorts of potential applications, if these findings play out.
That's fascinating. That's really great. My colleagues and I, we wrote a paper in Frontiers in Neurology on psychedelics for brain injury, and there's absolutely a huge opening window with these neuroplastic agents, MDMA being one, but a number of them I think will have great potential for stroke and brain injury.
That's actually her Gould's paper that's coming out tomorrow is basically showing that all psychedelics do this. So LSD, psilocybin, ibogaine, and even ketamine. So.
That's fascinating. Yeah, it's great to see that we've been able to understand its actions. When I was, undergraduate or early medical studies, it was MDMA's effects on the serotonin transporter. This chemical, and that was sort of where it makes you feel good because there's all this serotonin. but now we're talking at this much higher level of the network and the ability to learn new things.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like happening at the network, and then she's also got findings that literally these psychedelics are affecting gene expression. So it really goes deep. It's really interesting.
Do you want to mention her octopus research
got some
here?
nerds out there. I hear y'all.
She's famously done some work in octopi, or is it octopi? What has she found there? Do you want to share that?
Yeah, I'm just like, Gwendolyn is such a wonderful source, and she was so patient with me, just like on these long Zoom calls about like, what is neuroscience? But the reason I actually first met her on the phone, I guess, when her now famous Octopuses on Molly paper came out. I interviewed her for a Scientific American story. I meet the best sources for Scientific American. But yeah, so she dosed octopuses with MDMA, just kind of to see what would happen. But the thinking too is that, why not? Octopuses are very intelligent. You know, they're by far the most intelligent invertebrates. But at the same time, they are separated from humans and even vertebrates by this enormous evolutionary gulf. Like literally, we have more in common with dinosaurs than we do octopuses. Like half of their brain cells are outside of a central brain. Like they're really weird. They're like the closest we can come to aliens. So, you know, if an octopus shares something in common with us neurologically, then that means it's really, really ancient. So Gould's thinking was, okay, first of all, it'll be kind of funny to see what happens to these octopuses, but also if they respond in a way similar to people, that really tells us something about the evolutionary origins of sociality. Sure enough, after a few, not great dosing incidents, all the octopuses were safe, by the way. They went home. She finally got the dosing right, and these normally extremely antisocial octopuses, like they will do anything to avoid each other, or they'll just fight to the death. The one on the drug, like, started doing water ballet and, like, swam over to its, there was an octopus under a little cage. The other octopus, I mean, that's anthropomorphizing a little bit, but, you know, this octopus clearly was feeling more social on MDMA. She also looked at the octopus's genome and found that it had the same genes coding for this serotonin.
Transporter?
Thank you. I was like, yeah.
Transporter, yeah.
Again, the expert. Serotonin transporter, thank you, that we do. So she's thinking, okay, behaviorally and genetically, there's this role that serotonin plays that's super ancient, you know, like 500 million years old, and I just think that's a fascinating use of MDMA.
Truly remarkable. When I did my MAPS MDMA training, I watched these videos, and I really felt like MDMA-assisted therapy was giving us a microscopic window into emotionality, and like the way that we move through things, because it slows things down quite a bit. You can kind of see things, you take time, and I think these kinds of insights that it's giving us about sociality and how we process emotions and heal, I think will help us in a more fundamental way understand, you know, the origins of human and sociality, period.
Yeah, and it's just like really exciting that studies like that are being opened up, because absolutely. Now, you know, we're relaxing constraints on using things like MDMA.
Exactly, that's right. Thanks to intrepid people continuing to push the envelope. And so we talked about those avenues of investigation. So moral injury was something that I also wanted to ask you about with the work with PTSD and veterans and other communities that suffer PTSD. I was interested to see that in addition to its work on sort of processing trauma or fear that you might have sort of buried away, there's also a thought that it could help with this existential dimension of injury. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so moral injury is a phenomenon that especially, it doesn't just affect people who have been in war, but especially people who have been in war, soldiers, and it's defined as this existential soul injury. It's when you commit an act or, you know, witness an act being committed that you don't stop, that just goes against the very moral fabric of your being. So something that's very commonly reported as a source of this is, killing a woman or a child in war. So soldiers come back with this feeling of just like hating themselves, of feeling morally repugnant. And one of the things that MDMA-assisted therapy seems to do is, it allows you this tremendous feeling of self-forgiveness, of self-love, and just, being able to let go of that guilt, not forgetting it, not putting it behind you, but just being able to come to terms with it and to move forward.
I think there's that's sort of a deeper thing that I'm curious how that's going to turn out as we move into that. Okay, let's come back a little bit on law, and then we'll talk about the big question in the room about what do we do about non-medical approaches to MDMA, or how do we think about that? So So first of all, prohibition as an idea. What is exactly, did your research turn up any sort of models that we can use to think about this, ways in which we could integrate MDMA in a different way that's not in the medical therapeutic context? Talk about that, please.
Yeah, definitely. The group that is sponsoring the MDMA-assisted therapy trials for PTSD, MAPS, their whole mission is to basically not just medicalize MDMA, but to legalize MDMA, and not just MDMA, but all psychedelics. And there's other people who are proponents of doing the same for all drugs. And the basic idea behind that, which I had personally never really thought much about before I wrote this book, is that prohibition drives much of the harms of drug use. You're getting drugs that you don't know what is in your drugs. So let's just take MDMA for the sake of simplicity here. Anyone who wants to do MDMA right now has to buy it illegally, and unless they have like a chemist friend they trust, they're going to get it on the black market. They don't know what's in their drugs. There's been all kinds of adulterants found in MDMA. You might be getting methamphetamine. You might be getting all kinds of things that are more, bath salts, for example, that are more harmful than MDMA. You also don't know the dose you're taking, so you might be taking, 4 or 5 times potentially the dose that you thought you were taking. I actually interviewed a mom whose daughter had died this way. She thought she was just taking a normal MDMA roll, and she passed out and never woke up. So I personally came out of this reporting experience thinking that drugs should be regulated. And there's places that are pursuing that model. So in the Netherlands, they've put together an expert sort of board to talk about MDMA medicalization, but also looking forward as, okay, maybe we can legalize MDMA in the same way that we did with weed. We regulate its sale just like we do with, alcohol, with nicotine, with these other, literally drugs that are legal and that are socially acceptable. And I love too, it's like so Dutch, they're thinking about calling them X shops. So, yeah, we'll see.
Well, I think that's the question you raise. This book is great. You really touch on a lot of different elements, and you don't give a short shrift to this larger question around the communal use of MDMA and the extent to which our utilization of communal healing with music and dance is kind of I've heard one author call it an archaic technique of ecstasy, that this is something that goes way back, to ancient archaic times, that this is just how people heal and non-ordinary states, healing, music, and community. So I think that's that's a big deal, and that's sort of organically how people started using this all in different parts of the world. In your book, you talk about this sort of betterment of more well. Now you can be more connected, and you talk about Rick Doblin, the pioneer, founder of MAPS. He has his own MDMA experience when MDMA got scheduled, and he's going to have to wait, go on this 20-year journey that he's on now.
38-year journey.
Okay, a long time. But you describe an experience takes MDMA before it was banned, or I'm not. And he has an experience where he's a big sir, he's alone, and he feels the loving arms of gravity. That's how he feels held by the earth. And I thought that's very cool. If people can experience like a sense of connection to the planet like that. So, and of course, in this age of eco-anxiety and all the things that are happening, maybe is there some way that we can work towards such possibilities to destigmatize it, or create these kinds of scenarios? And what did you see out there when you reported on this that gave you hope?
Great question to end on. Yeah, so I asked a lot of my sources just a sort of like tongue-in-cheek question to end my interviews, and it was like, okay, well, is MDMA going to save the world? And I was actually surprised by some of the answers I got because, okay, obviously, no, that's not going to happen. Only we can save the world. But a lot of people think that MDMA could be used as a tool that gives people, for example, more bandwidth to care about things beyond like their own suffering. So, if we can heal our own trauma, if we can improve our relationships with other people, with those closest to us, then perhaps we'll have more bandwidth to work on things like environmental issues, to talk instead of fight each other. Yeah.
That's pretty big. More bandwidth, like
more bandwidth, yeah.
and that's at an individual level or a group level, or
yeah, exactly. It's both. I mean, so for example, I witnessed this really special gathering that's been happening in Brooklyn for, I don't know, 10, 15 years, and it's organized by this couple named Charlie and Shelley Winiger. And they are in their 70s, and they like to call themselves role models. And they bring together this group of people of all ages. So I attended their event last May. And, the youngest person was like 22, and the oldest person was something like 77. And it's just like this wonderful, and everybody's taking MDMA, obviously. And it's just this wonderful opportunity to come together and meet people that you wouldn't normally, and talk and dance and just be in the moment. So, okay, even if MDMA doesn't end war or save the planet, it can bring joy to individual lives and hopefully free us up to work on, things that matter to us personally. And if spread across a large enough population, maybe that can make a difference. Maybe that can nudge the world into a kinder and more loving and connected place.
Absolutely. I mean, you told this story. It was remarkable in there, in a Chicago clinical trial of MDMA in well people. It turned out one of the subjects that enrolled was a white nationalist who had recently been doxxed.
He was a leader of this white nationalist group. It was intense.
Tell that story. I thought that was remarkable.
I feel like this is a strange one to end on, but I will happily tell that story. Okay, hopeful.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's crazy, but but we learned something.
Yeah, definitely. This researcher, correct me if I pronounce her name wrong, Harriet DeWitt.
I think that's her.
Yeah, she's a researcher at University of Chicago, very serious scientist. And she was running a trial on MDMA and the sensitivity of touch or something. It had nothing to do with therapy. And she was in her office, and then her PhD student came in and was like, you have to see this. And he had just gone through the trial with some young guy. And at the end of the form, the man had written, I know what I have to do now. Google my name. And they're like, oh, what is this? This is kind of weird and ominous. So they Google his name, and it turns out, yes, he's this humiliated, fallen white supremacist, white nationalist, who is the leader of this faction and had had himself doxxed, and his name was spread all over the internet, and he lost his job. So Harriet is now oh my gosh, what is this guy gonna do? He's gonna go out and kill a bunch of people. Is that what he knows what he has to do? And we've just drugged him. So they go back and ask, okay, his name is Brendan, what is it you're gonna do? Or what is it you know you have to do? And he's like, I know now that all I have to do is love. So they wound up writing a research paper about this case study, and Harriet connected me with Brendan, who agreed to be interviewed for the book. But I do think it's really important to point out the limitations here. So people like to joke oh, we should put MDMA in Donald Trump's Diet Coke, or put MDMA into the water so the Russians will stop fighting the Ukrainians. But it doesn't work like that, it doesn't seem like it works like that. It's not like this miraculous loving feeling pops up. You have to be kind of primed to do the work. So Brendan, in a way, was primed to kind of reevaluate where he was in his life, the decisions he was made because of that doxing. And, he'll readily admit that he doesn't think this would have popped into his head if he wasn't already dealing with this tumultuous life situation. That said, MDMA could be a really powerful tool for potentially bringing people together and expanding people's minds who are, a little bit open to it. Not like the hardcore haters or whatever on each side. But there's trials, for example, going on underground with Israelis and Palestinians doing MDMA and ayahuasca together to just try to find common ground. So I think that's a really ripe area of exploration.
That's wonderful. Peace science. I think you can end on that if you want. That's beautiful. I was, our own you mentioned in your book that to destigmatize MDMA, it might be worth to talk about your own experiences with it. So I wanted to see if you wanted to share anything with the audience.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, destigmatization is huge, and I think it's just moving at breakneck speed. Like the fact that we're even having this conversation is huge. About half the scientists I spoke with, I would always ask them, have you done MDMA? And a lot of them would, or about half of them would demur and say like, oh, I can't say if I have and I can't say if I haven't, or oh, I'm not willing to go on the record, which is a legitimate thing, at least, in more traditional or conservative institutions. And also, even a few years ago, people could lose their jobs for talking about things like that openly. On the other hand, a lot of people are just opening up and saying, whatever, like, what do I have to hide? Yes, I do drugs recreationally, or I've tried this or that. Carl Hart at Columbia wrote an entire book about this. It's really fantastic. Just, if we want to decriminalize things, we need to first out ourselves and, come out of the drug closet and admit that we've done these things. As far as my own use, I've tried MDMA. So I, thank you.
Me too.
I don't know. I kind of feel like
beautiful.
I'm a shallow user of MDMA. I just really like to take it and go to parties, like raves. But my husband recently had a really, really positive experience using it therapeutically with the guidance of a certified therapist. So I've seen it work both ways.
Wonderful. And I've used it too, and I'm very grateful.
I was going to ask, your turn.
I've used it, yeah. I've part of healing circles, and I think it's profound, and I was really grateful, and I'm so excited that the university that I went to that kind of helped set me on a path was where it came from. And I was like, that's pretty cool. Like, what can we do with these kind of technologies to help us? So. Okay, so now we come to the question and answer portion. Thank you all for this portion. So let's give her a big hand for.
Thank you all.
Hello, everybody. This is the in the room question asking mic. So if you have anything you'd like to ask directly to Rachel, feel free to come up to this mic and ask it that way. We've also got the digital option, so you can. Shortly, it will come up on the screen. The projector is just warming up a little bit. But you can scan that QR code and it will get submitted digitally. I believe we've got one right now.
Yes, I got that one. Shall we start with that one first so the folks can come up? But the one question we have from the audience, from attendee number 2, 38 minutes ago they asked this question, so this is on their mind. How can I test if MDMA is not tainted?
Oh, that's such a great question. I'm so glad you asked it. So I have gotten really obsessive about testing my drugs because I'm the MDMA book person. I have to know everything about my drugs. There's a lab in Spain called Energy Control. Actually, it's a nonprofit, but they have a lab. You can send them samples of anything, and they'll test not only for impurities, but for concentration. So that's really important because then you know, how pure your MDMA is. So I've had samples come back that are 60%, and I've had samples come back that are 88%, which is like a huge variability. So Energy Control, check them out. There's also at-home testing kits you can use that can test for adulterants. But I honestly just, if you can afford it, if you have the resources, send it off.
And those are qualitative home tests, like kits, or just change colors. But this is quantitative tests that you can get
I'm not a chemist at all, so I'd rather leave it to the professionals.
I think there's also a lab in San Francisco that does it as well. So if it's shorter to ship, and in other countries, people have set up a lot of these programs. So okay. We have a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Do either of you know of any work that's being done with MDMA? With the drug, yes. and for people who have dementia.
Oh, someone else asked me this question recently, and I personally, unfortunately, have not heard of that. My grandmother passed from Alzheimer's, so I dearly wish that. But have you heard anything?
I guess the two things that come to my mind, I know in Dame, what's her name, Amanda Fielding, the Baroness in the UK who started the Beckley Foundation, she said that they're working towards creating a home for dementia patients in Switzerland where they'll be administering LSD, small doses of LSD. She describes quite a bit of some experiences of anecdotally where she's heard that some folks were able to take some LSD who were pretty advanced dementia or more advanced cases that had some lucidity come out of that. It's possible. Psychedelics have an anti-inflammatory effect in the brain, we think. It's one of the mechanisms by which they could be acting. We've also, folks who work in palliative care are interested in the use of psychedelic assisted therapy for caregivers of families who are struggling with the loss that can occur in dementia. So it's I think there's a really great piece there. And yeah, as far as brain, and then we were talking about that brain injury and brain strokes and things like that. I think there's definitely a future of understanding if we can catch things early. Dementia conditions are usually due to deposition of proteins in the brain, amyloid plaques and things, and then those cause inflammation. And if you can kind of shift the brain in a modulatory way early on, maybe things can kind of get cleared up so that you have a different course. But it is definitely area of interest and investigation, and I hope folks like what will happen in Switzerland keep an eye on that, because I think they're going to be ahead of the curve like they were with LSD psychotherapy 50 years ago. Oh, right, that's right. Albert Hopper is Swiss. That's right.
You talked about soldiers and PTSD, and I was kind of wondering about the DoD. I know the DoD won't touch this as long as it's Schedule 1, but if it's rescheduled, do you think there'd still be opposition within the DoD to allowing active duty folks or recently retired folks in the VA to use this therapy?
MAPS is definitely actively working on that. There's been more hesitancy from the DoD. I mean, it took, not 3 decades, but 25 years for the VA to come around. So the DoD is still a work in progress, but people are working on that and are in active conversations with them. Do you know anything more about that?
In your book, you talk about the time when David Presti went to the VA to ask them in San Francisco.
It's 92, 93.
Yeah, if they'd be willing to work with MDMA in treatment of PTSD, and the directors just kept saying no, no, no. But then in the last 3 years, I'd say or so, I know Loma Linda VA, Portland VA, Bronx VA. So these aren't DoD, but this is I think the agency that's already shown. They're willing to, and I had some colleagues who were some of the docs who were working in those trials. They had a lot of openness inside the Department of Veterans Affairs to get those studies going. So I think that's, I see that happening. But I do know MAPS and Dublin did work with DoD. I don't know the details on that, but if you look at their bulletins, you can see they were able to get some buy-in, some meetings they've attended. So I do think that that's definitely on the horizon.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, if and when positive results start really coming through, I think it's going to be an easier conversation.
The statistics you wrote about suicides in the veteran population, do you remember some of those numbers just to share with the group? It was frightening. It was just shocking.
It's more people than it actually died in the Middle East that have committed suicide.
You said from the global war on terror, it was 40,000 had died, U.S. soldiers. So we really need to do something right away. Obviously, I'm interested in peacemaking too, stopping trauma, but we have so many people that have now suffered this. And what's amazing is that all of this work started before the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which was a huge amount of PTSD from veterans from those wars. And so it's kind of a confluence.
Thanks for all of the great information. My dad was one of those people treated with LSD for his alcoholism in 1962 or 1963 at a VA hospital in Topeka, Kansas. And he was a terrible alcoholic, and he never drank again. And he'd been a severe alcoholic. It was part of a 3-month inpatient treatment. So I just like to point that out.
That's incredible.
A real person. I know my dad who went through that.
How old were you when he went into the treatment? Just
It was the summer before my sophomore year in high school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah. Now, I would have to say he kind of remained what you would call a dry drunk, but he didn't drink anymore, and that was huge.
Okay.
2 questions, though. One is, what do you know about the possibilities of abuse of the drug and how addictive it is? I was surprised to hear you say that somebody died, overdosed, and actually died from it. And then the other, and I might be a little confused here, but do people microdose with MDMA?
Let's start with the microdosing.
Okay.
I have not heard of people doing that, and I don't think it would be effective or a good idea. Doctor?
I haven't heard much about it. I have heard of people doing it, but I
Okay.
don't know anything about its efficacy or utility or safety.
Yeah. In terms of the drug itself, safety, if you're doing it in a therapeutic setting with a professional, there haven't been serious adverse or effects, no deaths, nothing like that. You get some side effects like teeth grinding or maybe some nausea. But again, back to that issue of prohibition, of people taking too much of the drug, of taking adulterated drugs, or of putting themselves in environments or undertaking behaviors that exacerbate the potential harms of MDMA. Definitely, there are deaths every year. It's a vanishingly small number when you think about the millions of people literally around the world who take MDMA every year recreationally or, at home with a partner. But things like overheating, that's a really big cause of deaths. You're dancing in a poorly ventilated room. MDMA also messes with your thermoregulation and slightly increases your heart rate. So overheating can be a big deal. There's been some deaths where people try to overcompensate for the overheating by drinking too much water, and they wind up diluting their blood sodium levels and dying that way. That was more in the 90s. People now have heard about those cases pretty much and know not to chug a gallon of water. That's pretty much it.
Addiction.
Overheating.
Question.
The addiction. So MDMA isn't physically addicting. If anything, if you continue to use MDMA too much, so if you're using it like once a week or twice a week for an extended period of time, its effects actually start to diminish, its pleasurable effects, and you get these like really jittery, like not fun side effects. So people tend, even if they're using it a lot at raves or going through a stage in their life, to taper off that use just because it doesn't feel good anymore. Behaviorally, that's another question. If your friends are going out or like you're seeking solace on the dance floor or whatever, that's usually where people get into trouble with too much MDMA use. But the psychiatrists and psychologists I spoke to who had patients who, came to them and said, like, I'm using too much MDMA, or I had a time in my life when I was using too much, it just usually self-resolves, again, because it stops feeling good.
Thank you. We'll just 1 second. This question came in a few minutes ago, and then we'll come right back to you. If MDMA is approved by the FDA for therapeutic use, do you foresee the clinics where people will go to use it with the therapist being similar to the ones where ketamine therapy is now offered?
Okay, so I haven't done any reporting on ketamine therapy myself, so all I really know about it is what I've absorbed through reading media articles and things and just talking to people. MDMA, if it's approved, the goal here is for insurance to cover it and also for there to be a program through MAPS. MAPS is trying to work on this for people who can't afford it or who don't have insurance to get subsidized or even get it for free. That's still a work in progress. We're still working within the framework of U.S. healthcare, but ketamine, for example, isn't covered at all by insurance, correct?
Well, yeah, the sessions themselves, but if you do, in a ketamine-assisted psychotherapy model, which is what we do with the Ames Institute, you can You can use insurance for some of the screening, preparation, integration, therapeutic sessions. And so I could say that model that we use there is definitely influenced by the MDMA-assisted therapy framework.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much how they structure things. So I think it would be similar to answer the question here, but it's it's different drug, longer action, more preparation, I think, and things like that. So
Definitely.
But I think it's definitely what people are talking about as a roadmap to help us. As far as insurance, the other issue that we need to grapple with is therapists that are serving communities that are like them. The connecting between the setting, and the guides consistent with that are culturally competent, that are consistent with the background that the patient is coming in from, and that's been a real growing need that people have been talking about. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you for facilitating this discussion. I'm interested in hearing more about clinical trials involving folks who are facing end of life, such as in hospice, and how MDMA and other psychedelic-assisted therapy can assist them, and what are the impacts or implications for decriminalization and recreational drug use, if that is sort of the entry point into this conversation.
That's an interesting thought. I don't know if the implications so there's a lot of things that we do in end-of-life care. I'm a palliative and hospice doc that we don't allow for the general population. We give them all kinds of special exceptions, special drug access. So I do certainly think it's culturally will impact in terms of people's comfort and awareness, like for relief of pain, for example. We use pain medicines in end-of-life care quite a bit, and so people have been around that. They maybe feel less stigmatized about opioids or drugs like that. There's a lot of phobia, but so I think in that way, people will see this as a therapeutic, a real valuable tool that could help with their loved one's serious illness. There was one clinical trial that was done by Phil Wolfson on MDMA for a serious life-threatening illness, and there was definitely some positive outcomes, but it wasn't huge. The data wasn't like a big slam dunk, but it was a small study. Originally, the plan for Charlie Grob at UCLA was to do an MDMA in cancer. That was going to be the first FDA-approved study on MDMA, but the FDA said, no, we want you to start in healthy or in normal. So they didn't end up doing that study. But definitely that's still on the horizon. A lot of the work in end-of-life distress, when I was in NYU there, I saw the work of the psilocybin cancer anxiety group. So the use of psilocybin in hospice care and in palliative care and in oncology clinics, that's sort of been a lot more well-studied, I would say. And I think I'm hoping to see, I think but definitely MDMA, as I was mentioning earlier about caregivers and loved ones, I think there's definitely a piece, because a lot of palliative care and hospice care actually is care of the whole family unit. And I think there's a lot of folks who are interested in seeing if that can be part of that piece of care as well, so you treat the whole unit. But I think existential. That's why I was asking about moral injury and the existential dimensions of that. I wouldn't be surprised that would also be play a role, and I wouldn't say it's either or. I think these are like multiple different dimensions of rapid healing that could help patients in the stages at the end of life, which is basically saying thank you, saying that I love you, to their loved ones, saying I forgive you, or receiving forgiveness and saying goodbye. These are kind of the stages that people talk about. If you can kind of help people through those stages, they'll have, that you won't traumatize the future generations with the grief and the misery that might happen at the end of life. You can have maybe what we call a good death, and I definitely, that's a traditional use of psychedelics too. So I'm hoping that, as far as decriminalization goes, I mean, we are working to decriminalize or work on DEA scheduling of at least psilocybin to make it available for emergency use under the right to try law or such frameworks like the breakthrough therapy status that this drug has. And we have a court case at the Ninth Circuit. It's sort of going on right now, so you can stay tuned for that. So that's definitely a strong lever that we've used to sort of make the laws move faster, because obviously people don't have much time who are at that stage.
I'm curious about repressed memory retrieval in MDMA. And you were talking about the mechanism of action earlier in neuroplasticity, and I'm wondering if what we know about that. Do those two things coincide, and what do we know about repressed memories?
And definitely there's lots of reports of repressed memories coming up in MDMA-assisted therapy, and that's part of why it works subjectively, at least. You can deal with those memories and engage with them and acknowledge them and process them in ways that you don't before. Do you want to get to the science of that?
Well, all I can tell you is that people have been talking about repressed memories and some kind of mind-altering drugs for a very long time. In the 1930s, the AMA testified in Congress that cannabis was unparalleled in its ability to help bring back forgotten memories. And so any drug that sort of changes your current state of fight or flight or your sympathetic central nervous system, you can be in a different state and maybe retrieve. A lot of times, when you try to like remember something, or if you put yourself in that state of mind that you were in at that time versus now, it's easier to sort of recall something. So just as in terms of like a general shift in let's say your set point, I think that's a more generic thing to say. Beyond as far as like, what we were talking about is sort of also laying down new pathways, learning new things, right? And that sometimes requires forgetting certain things, right? Or to learn something new. Okay, I used to do it this way, and now I'm going to do it this way. And so that's kind of an interesting, there's kind of a two-way thing on that. So I don't know of any studies on it, but I'm sure there will be.
Oh, I just want to add one point. I have also heard anecdotes of people using MDMA recreationally. They're just going out for a good time, and suddenly they are flooded with this sudden realization of a repressed memory, and it turns into like a really traumatizing experience because you're at a club and suddenly you remember something that you haven't in years. And I've heard it going one of two ways. If you're with a really supportive group of friends, okay, you can go and try to work that out and deal with it, and then come out of that experience with, okay, I need to figure this out. Or, if you're not with supportive friends, it can go terribly wrong. So that is one of the psychological dangers of taking MDMA recreationally.
It's funny, in your book, you quote some kind of psychiatrist or doctor that said, well, some things should just stay buried, shouldn't they? Like, why do that, right?
Some British guy, like, why all the sniveling?
Right, you said he whined about it.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought that was funny.
We have time for one more question.
Do you have a question there?
I don't know.
Okay. First of all, thank you for being here. I wondered about, you've mentioned multiple compounds, psychoactive compounds, and I wondered if there's any indication of efficacy of, for example, MDMA versus ketamine versus LSD, and are they useful for are they particularly useful, for example, in end of life or trauma? How do they compare? Does it depend on the individual? Just if you can speak to that. Thanks.
Definitely. So I guess at the very basic level, that study that's coming out tomorrow in Nature really shows that all these psychedelics are acting, again, on the same level of gene expression. So sort of at their baseline, they're doing the same thing. That said, Gould-Olin did find that, at least in mice, the critical periods with these different drugs open for different periods of time, and that period of time tracked with how long the trip in a human lasts. So, ketamine is like 30 minutes or so, and for mice, they were in this open critical period state for a week. Then, you go up to like psilocybin and MDMA, those last like 4 to 5, 6 hours. Mice were open for a few more weeks, up to LSD, that's like a 10 to 12 hour trip. Mice are open for longer. And then they did ibogaine, which can be like a 72 hour trip. And the mice were still open when they stopped measuring like a month later. So, I mean, So there is some thought that like, okay, maybe ketamine is like giving someone like a gentle push on like a rowboat, and ibogaine is like shoving them out of a plane. And we just need to like figure out how to tune these drugs for, the most fitting purpose. So ibogaine is often used to help break people of really entrenched habits, addictions to opioids, for example. And I think also it at some point is going to come down to a personal preference. There were some people I interviewed who were like, I'm just not an MDMA. It's boring. It doesn't do things for me. I need my ego to dissolve if I'm going to get anything out of this. So I don't know. Is there anything else you'd like to add on that question?
That's really wonderful. I can't wait to see this paper. But I was just going to say that there are medical factors to consider as well. Who can tolerate something for how long, other drugs that they might be on or contraindications. It's nice to have options because we are all come in different shapes, sizes, colors, and abilities to tolerate different things, heart conditions, and medicine interactions. So I think that's one thing to say. And the other thing I was going to say is that there is. Back in the days when we heard the questioner about her father getting the LSD psychotherapy in Spring Grove in Maryland, that's where they did also a lot of those LSD alcoholism studies. They did combination studies there. They would use psilocybin, and then at the end of the psilocybin session, they would give the patient ketamine. So it was, and then also in sort of the underground utilization of MDMA, there's a very common protocol of using MDMA and psilocybin. And in your book, you talk about Grateful Dead and MDMA and LSD, as
candy flipping.
Right, exactly, right. So it's sort of like, and again, if you look back at other traditional use patterns of these medicines, these substances, there are combinations. So I think that's, but it is good to understand the differences and then also realize that you can maybe have some medleys, and maybe that will be a future for us. But as long as we are careful, have good containers, and remember these substances are neutral. The CIA work and the Army work show you how much these could be used for ill. You create that window and you reprogram people in a negative way, right? That could have a disastrous consequence. So
yeah, that's the Manson family.
Exactly, right. Yeah, that's right.
On that note.